Everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out to our inaugural fall event. This event is entitled Terrorism, Human Intelligence, and Homeland Security. And before we get into the details about the speaker and the topic, I'm going to say a few words about our school and, of course, who I am. My name is Kevin. Some of you may know me. I think more than about a quarter of you have come here before. For those new people, we thank you for showing up today. I help run the events, and I do a lot of public outreach here. So if you'd ever like to stop by for a personal tour, I'm more than happy to give you one of these two rooms and give you a little bit of backstory. Brief introduction of who we are. We are a graduate school. For those of you who do not know, we pride ourselves in bringing up the next generation of foreign policy leaders in the intelligence and foreign policy communities. And I believe we have 5 master's degree programs in statecraft and 18 certificates of study. So we more than encourage you to come by and talk to our admissions officers or whomever else you may be interested in talking to. Let's proceed to the topic. I know that this is a very relevant topic. Of course, we are all members right now, geographically or otherwise, of this community, DC, East Coast, United States, and in a broader catch-all, the Western world. I think our esteemed presenter today will have some remarks on the nature and intersection of terrorism, homeland security, and a few deterrence practices that have been adopted or maybe we may need to propose to adopt. I am also would very much now like to introduce the speaker himself. Mr. Sam Faddis has had a distinguished record of service in the Central Intelligence Agency as an operations officer, serving in a bunch of different contexts in the Middle East, South Asia, Europe. Specifically, I think something of particular note was that he was part of the lead team prior to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So he obviously has a lot of experience on the ground. From there, he moved to the CIA's. He became the point lead for the Weapons of Mass Destruction program in the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, and he has gone on to have a distinguished record of service in his local community and the national intelligence community. Without further ado, I want to thank you, sir, for coming, and I open up the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me. Can everybody hear me in the back? Fine? Since we've now filled like 2 rooms, I think I could see everybody back there. What I want to talk about, my primary focus today is really to talk about human intelligence in the context of dealing with Islamic extremism, Islamic terrorism, particularly as it applies to Homeland Security. I think we have about an hour for the talk and time for questions thereafter. It is doubtful that I'm really going to talk in prepared remarks for an hour. What I'd like to do is reserve as much time as possible to address your questions. And then I know we're talking about stuff that you're interested in as opposed to what I guessed that you should be interested in. And those would be, feel free to hit me with follow-up questions on my remarks and also on other subjects that you might be under the impression that I might be able to shed some light on. I'd be happy to talk about those. Before I start talking about human intelligence and how that applies to Homeland Security and this whole business of combating Islamic terrorism, what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk for a few minutes as sort of establishing a context. You guys that just appeared, you can actually hear me in the back? All right, excellent. There's not like an 8-minute delay or something on the speakers? It's not like talking to Mars spacecraft or something? Okay, cool. What I want to do is I want to establish a little bit of context. Okay, in terms of, we're going to talk about human intelligence, so why do we care? What's the context? What are the parameters? What's going on out there that makes this of any interest to any of us? So first of all, let me throw this out. I'm going to throw out probably about 3 different factors here. Number 1, we are, in my opinion, involved in a war with Islamic extremism. And I say that every word in what I just said, I've chosen very specifically for a very specific reason. This is certainly not a war in the same context as World War II in terms of a conventional conflict. It is nonetheless a conflict on that scale, and I think we have to understand it that way. But I also choose the words Islamic extremism in my sense, in my meaning, to be very clear that it is not my view or my assertion that we are somehow now at war with Islam. Okay, having spent a lot of time on the ground in places where there were maybe 2 or 3 Americans and 50 other guys working with us on our side, in most of those cases, every one of those guys was Muslim, and the people who were doing the bulk of the dying on our side were Muslim, and the people who are still doing the bulk of the dying, if you will, in simplistic terms, on our side in this conflict, are Muslim. Now, this may be a civil war within Islam. We may go, I don't want to get lost in that characterization. But the point is, we are at war with Islamic extremists. We are not at war with Islam. If you have any doubts about that, pull up the video, if you can stomach it, of what happened to the Jordanian pilot captured by ISIS 18 months ago, who was burned alive in a cage. That's not just because they sit around in the caliphate thinking of more gruesome ways to kill people, although that may be an element of it. It was a specific point that they were making, and that point was that as a Muslim daring to fight against the caliphate, he deserved to be sentenced to the fires of hell, quite literally. It was their method for symbolizing that he would spend eternity in damnation and literally burning in the fires of hell. That's a very deliberate, very specific statement and ought to bring home very clearly what is the nature of the conflict. Okay, so I've gone to great pains to make clear what I'm saying. Why do we care? In the context of figuring out how we're going to fight this thing, human intelligence, all of this, what's my point? Well, my point is that there are implications that you need to, that has. There are conclusions you need to draw from that. So, it is by nature an ideological struggle. Whether you like that, whether you don't like that, whether you're particularly comfortable with that, whether you're Christian, whether you don't have any faith, that doesn't make any difference because you didn't decide to start this war. It is for them an ideological struggle, and there are implications from that. There are probably quite a few implications. I'm going to throw out a couple that are relevant to the talk. 1, this is an ideological struggle, and particularly in the terms that ISIS talks as sort of the biggest and most dangerous foe that we're facing in terms of Islamic extremism. It is a war that is expressly couched in apocalyptic terms. This is not just a fight, this is the fight, this is the last fight, these are the end of days. And that is very explicit and very clear and sort of drips off of every video they produce and every pronouncement they make. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, what that means is they're not stopping this fight. That means they're not quitting and going home. That means they're not suing for peace and walking away, because this is literally Armageddon. This is the end. And that's what this is all about. And by the way, if you die in the course of the conflict, you're guaranteed you're going to paradise. So if you're looking for someone to quit and get tired of the conflict, it is not the Islamic extremists you're facing. They are not going to go home, get tired of this, say we changed our minds. You may defeat them, crush them, cut off their ability to convert more people. You may do all sorts of things. You will not wait them out of this conflict. They may wait us out. The second implication relevant to what I'm talking about here would be this. It is an ideological struggle. While it is waged sometimes in the open in relatively conventional terms, as it currently is, say, near Mosul in northern Iraq, the real struggle that's going on worldwide is an ideological one, and one that's occurring in the shadows, and one that involves heavily conversion. So that means that most of the fighting, if you will, I said up front that this is a war, but a war that is very different from what we think about in terms of 1944. Most of the fighting to be done in this war is a war that is fighting that will be done in the shadows. 40% of ISIS members being identified now in the United States are in fact converts to Islam. They are not folks who came from Islamic countries and were born into Islam. They are people who were born as Christians, as Jews, as whatever, and converted. And we have something like 30,000 foreign fighters that have flooded into the caliphate areas. Many of those are coming from Islamic countries. Many of them are coming from Europe and other countries, and amongst them are huge numbers of converts. General Hayden, much more eloquent than I, my old boss, has made this observation. This is a war in which killing the enemy when you find him is relatively easy. I'm paraphrasing, as I said, he's much more eloquent than I. Relatively easy to kill the enemy if you find him, really hard to find the enemy. The whole key to this is finding the enemy. That has a huge implication for the significance of intelligence. I mean, in fact, I would submit to you it means that really what you're involved in is a war that is ultimately all about intelligence and the quality of your intelligence. All right, second point that I want to make about this as sort of a backdrop, as context. We are at war with radical Islam, Islamic extremism. We could go off and talk about the details of the exact theology, but that's for another time and another place. Point two, we're not winning this war. We are not, the narrative that's sort of always sort of there as a subtext, never clearly announced, that has not only been a narrative of this administration, but quite frankly, probably the narrative of the previous administration was that we're just about there, that we've turned the corner, that the worst is behind us, that time is on our side, that we're always just about to see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Hoping again that it's not a train at the end of the tunnel. Not true, right? We are not winning this conflict. We may or may not, the Iraqi army with a bunch of Shia militiamen may or may not take Mosul sometime in the near future. The Islamic Caliphate may or may not lose most of its territory in Syria, Iraq. It doesn't really matter. Leaving aside the question of how long that will hold and how long it will take before another Sunni insurgency starts, all of these groups, Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, have long since moved on. ISIS alone has something like 35 affiliates around the world at this point. We've got the FBI, I don't know what the current number is, roughly 1,000 open investigations at any one point in time of ISIS members on our soil. Watch the news, see the scope of the attacks that have occurred. We are not turning the corner. We have not cracked the code. Whatever other verbiage you want to put out there, not true. Maybe at best we're in some kind of stalemate. Quite frankly, I think that's probably exaggerating where we are. Three, since I'm in the mode of throwing out depressing statements, let's just add another one. It has the potential to get much worse before it gets better. And I don't mean that just in the context of spreading more groups, all of this stuff, which I've already alluded to. Let me talk about weapons of mass destruction for a moment, as the guy who used to be responsible for the unit that chased all terrorist WMD programs worldwide. Once upon a time, we worried about chemical terrorism. And we would point to Aum Shinrikyo and the subway in Tokyo as the example of one time it had happened, and oh my God, we hope we don't go back there. Okay, ISIS has a fully developed chemical weapons capability. They routinely use chemical weapons on the battlefield. We crossed that bridge. That's not science fiction or speculation or where we might go. That is where we are today. They have a fully developed chemical weapons capability. Any doubts about the seriousness of that? The French, about 6 months ago, took atropine, which is a nerve agent antidote, out of military stocks and distributed it nationwide to hospitals and medical clinics across all of France. That tells you that they are operating in an environment right now where they expect that any day they could experience a terrorist attack using nerve agent on their soil for real. Not an exercise, not pretend injectors like many of you have played with at various points in your careers, for real, sitting in stockpiles in every hospital because they expect that can happen. A few months ago, we had arrests in Kenya of individuals associated with ISIS who were apparently working on a plot to stage a biological weapons attack using anthrax taken from a hospital, I think in Uganda, if I recall the details exactly. We are on the cusp of that becoming a reality. We have in the last year had real-world, hard, factual investigations of ISIS actions focused on nuclear reactors in Europe. Casing of nuclear reactors. Apparently preparation for kidnapping individuals associated with nuclear reactors. Very clear evidence that it is not aspirational, but it is real world right now being put in. We're on the cusp of this becoming a real operation, seizing and melting down a nuclear reactor. Not the hardest thing to do, quite frankly, once you've taken control of the reactor. And when you're all done with that, whatever the area is that the plume covered, that's Fukushima, right? That's what you have. You have the Fukushima dead zone wherever that was. We got a nuclear reactor here on the Chesapeake Bay and Calvert Cliffs, about 20 miles from this spot. We have obviously intense interest in radiological weapons and all sorts of evidence that people are looking for those and attempting to acquire them. And I can tell you that even before I retired, every day we were involved with interdicting some attempt to acquire radiological material. So what that means is we're at war with these guys, we're not winning, and the future is not necessarily a succession of attacks on the scale of Orlando or even the Brussels metro bombing and airport attacks. The future is potentially biological weapons attacks that force the evacuation of an entire city, or a meltdown of a reactor that forces us to evacuate an American city, and guess what? We don't go back. Not just we moved millions of people, but I don't know when we go back. Tell me when people will move back to Chernobyl, and I'll tell you when we would reoccupy that zone. That's the scope of what we're dealing with. That's the seriousness of what we're dealing with. And other than the fact that it kind of entertains me to be just incredibly depressing and just watch everybody get really dour faces, the point for hitting you with all of that way is to get across the message is that we need to get this right. We can't continue to muddle along hoping it gets better and just hoping they sort of go away. That is not an answer, that's not a solution, that's not an option. So we have to come to terms with this. We have to grab a hold of it. We have to figure out what we're going to do. So I said we're not winning. Why aren't we winning? That's probably multiple hours of conversation for why we aren't winning. We could start by talking about a complete absence of any policy in Iraq and Syria that addresses the fundamental political, ethnic, and religious factors that are fueling the Sunni insurgency, which is what ISIS draws its energy from. Okay, we could go down that road. That would eat the rest of my talk, and that's not really where I want to focus for our purposes today. Certainly, one of the reasons we're not winning is because of the quality of our intelligence. I said before, or the lack thereof. I said before that we are involved in a war in which finding the enemy is hard, killing him once found relatively easy. Two guys who were going to shoot up a disco on the disco floor at 2 o'clock in the morning with AK-47s is a horror. Two guys identified a few days before as intending to do that is a relatively short operation by a SWAT team in any major American city, and it's over and nothing happens. That's And terrorists, quite frankly, are not particularly eager to engage in gunfights with people who actually shoot back. But the quality of our intelligence is a huge issue. We are mired in what amounts to a cycle whereby we sit, we wait, we're hit, we investigate and clean up afterward. Perhaps we arrest a couple of support personnel who didn't blow themselves up or weren't killed in the attack. And then we go back to sitting and waiting to be hit again. Was a report done, I think 2 years ago now, by a commission. I'm not much of a fan of commissions, but I'll make an exception in this case, that reviewed 5 of the most major attacks on U.S. soil up to that point that were involved with Islamic extremism. So this was prior to San Bernardino, and it was prior to Orlando, but it included the Tsarnaev brothers and the Boston Marathon attacks. Included Major Hassan, included David Headley, it included a couple of other guys, one of the threats to the New York subway, and the 5th individual I forget. But in any event, very exhaustive review of the work that was done. The bottom line is this. In some cases, the attacks went forward. In some cases, the attacks did not go forward. In none of those 5 cases did we have any intelligence of our own that we had derived giving us any warning whatsoever about those attacks impending. This is through 2013. So it's a few years out of date, but still relatively current. That despite this entire gigantic apparatus, that we have no warning whatsoever. So why? And I'm going to focus primarily on the quality of human intelligence, or the lack of human intelligence, and give you a series of observations. First, because despite all of the discussion, rhetoric, and review, it is my opinion that we drew the wrong conclusions from 9/11. And that may be strange to say, given that it's been 15 years. And probably a little bit of an exaggeration, because probably many of you have read the 9/11 Commission report, as I have several times. I think it's a pretty authoritative document. I think it looked pretty comprehensively at a lot of things. But in terms of political discourse and the lessons we drew from it, it was boiled down to effectively one assertion. And that assertion was that the problem was that we failed to connect the dots. That we failed to take the information we had, connect it all, and make the correct conclusions based on those bits of information. I don't really dispute that. I think the conclusions about parts of the community not talking to other parts of the community are valid. I think lots of those conclusions are correct. I think none of them actually represent the central, most important truth that we should have taken away, which is not that we didn't connect the dots, it was that we didn't collect enough dots in the first place. That we should not have been reduced, given the size of our intelligence apparatus, our focus, our budget, the amount of time that had been crystal clear that al-Qaeda was developing, etc. We should not have been reduced to trying to glean inferences from handfuls of bits and pieces of intelligence. Because if you look at that report and read through it and everything else about 9/11, the first thing you're going to realize is that we apparently have not a single source actually inside this terrorist organization talking to us at any level. I don't mean a guy standing next to bin Laden getting his most private confidences. I mean anybody in the organization on our payroll talking to us from an organization that has already blown up 2 of our embassies, already almost sunk a U.S. destroyer, and an organization run by a guy who about every other day issues a new statement announcing that he's at war with us. And yet we don't have a source inside that organization. So my point in saying that I think we draw the wrong conclusions is that we sort of skipped completely over this. Because the first question is, how is that possible? Why is that true? How is it possible that you have an organization? I'm focusing now on CIA, talk about FBI at various points here as well. How is it possible that an organization that was created in 1947 expressly to ever prevent a surprise attack on us on the scale of Pearl Harbor, in 2001 allows 19 guys with box cutters to kill almost 3,000 Americans, and we don't have a single source who even has a clue that that operation was ever planned? So, because we don't focus on that, we don't fix the reasons why that's true. Why is that true? Well, speaking in shorthand, so I don't subject you to me being here for 3.5 hours. Because you have an organization that was built basically to chase Cold War targets. Because you have an organization that puts almost all of its officers abroad, actual operational personnel under diplomatic cover in official institutions. Because you have an organization that in every way, including risk aversion and methodology and tradecraft, is designed to go penetrate diplomatic targets, maybe military targets if they're friendly, chase KGB guys who play by the rules, but doesn't really have anything in its inventory that equips it to crawl into the belly of the beast. And by now I mean Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these organizations. Now, since 9/11, we've done a lot of things with CIA. We've given them, and by the way, this is not a knock on individual officers in the organization who are out there trying within these constraints to do the best job they can. Since 9/11, we've thrown a lot of money and personnel at the agency. Since 9/11, we've authorized a lot of lethal action. Since 9/11, we've put people into places that we didn't put them before. Since 9/11, we have fundamentally changed nothing about this structure, so that we still have people who are abroad, very poorly positioned to penetrate these organizations in terms of cover, background, ethnicity, makeup. And we are overly reliant, frankly, in most cases, on what the local liaison service is going to hand us, if they know and if they choose to tell us. A reason. Other reasons. Because I think there is a fundamental lack of understanding at the policy level and the level of people who are making decisions about how human intelligence works, how tradecraft works. So let me throw those terms out. How espionage works, right? On most days, walking around Washington, D.C., it seems like every other person I meet is an intelligence officer now of some ilk. No offense to them. Virtually none of them are actually operations officers and case officers, right? Just like every guy that was ever assigned to a special forces group, if you don't ask him the right questions, it's going to sound an awful lot like he went to the Q course and he has the flash and all that stuff, when in fact he was probably in some support capacity. He kind of stood next to the guys with green beret. Yes, I'm portraying my bias as an old case officer. But the point is, my real point is this. Out of this whole gigantic intelligence community, even forget about policymakers, there are virtually no people in it who actually go on the street and run operations and recruit sources. Even within the Central Intelligence Agency, I'm not going to get into numbers which are all classified, easily 80, probably closer to 90% of the people in CIA are in fact not case officers, not operations officers. It is an arcane, weird little world. It is more art than science. You cannot run it like a bureaucracy. More does not make it better. I don't need 120 guys. I need 6 guys, and I need them to be the right guys. And then, by the way, I need you to get out of my way. I need you to stop with the rules, the regulation, the process, the unjust levels of review. I am not arguing for rogue organizations or organizations that break American law. No patience for it. The CIA works for the American people. But the point is, this is an arcane world. This is a very specialized craft, quite frankly. And most of what we have done since 9/11, if anything, has been counterproductive to that craft. 4,000 people working for the Director of National Intelligence, none of whom collect a single piece of intelligence themselves. Sitting on top of the apparatus is not helpful. More lines on a wiring diagram, more review, more interagency working groups. None of this is helpful when we're talking about the key issue. And the key issue is, are we or are we not going to convince this guy who's a member of ISIS to come across the line and go to work for us? And that comes down to very special people, very properly seasoned, highly trained, an eclectic mix of skills working that problem. So it's not just that a lot of what we have done since 9/11 has not made it better, has not fixed the problem. In many cases, it hasn't made it better. In many cases, it has made it worse. Related to this, a general belief that throwing money at the problem and resources at the problem guarantees success. We'll create a new agency, 4 new buildings, 5,000 more people staring at flat-screen computer monitors. There's nobody still collecting any more intelligence on the ground in Yemen. There's still nobody who's got a source inside this portion of the Pakistani Taliban. There's still nobody who's got a source inside ISIS. I don't know what they're looking at on the flat-screen TVs. Actually, sometimes I do know what they're looking at on the flat-screen TVs. That's another subject. Another element I touch on very briefly is this, and I'm hesitating here because I always struggle to find the exact term to use here. And I guess the best expression I would use for it would be militarization of human intelligence. I was running counter-terrorist operations 30 years ago, and one of the guys who at that point was pushing very heavily for the fact that we needed to be armed in situations where it was not traditional that we be armed, because we needed to push the envelope, because we needed to be aggressive. I have no problem with the fact that there are certain elements to the war we are involved in that require some degree of, if you will, militarization of intelligence operations. That people have to be prepared to defend themselves, and that unfortunately lethal action is necessary. The fact remains that when your sole objective becomes the targeting of individuals and killing of individuals, you are by definition cutting off your source of intelligence every time you do that. So we used to talk in terms of kill and capture operations. We don't seem to talk a lot about capture anymore. That's how we solved the problem with Guantanamo. We just don't take anybody alive anymore. I wish that was a joke, but it's true. But on top of that, you know what's better than capturing the guy who runs operations for ISIS in this region? Recruiting the guy who runs operations for ISIS in his operation. Because then I don't just find out from him what happened every day prior to him being captured. I find out what's happening right now and what the plans are for the future. And that really is the essence of human intelligence and the whole point of having this organization. But we have largely abandoned that, probably because we haven't really fixed any of the reasons why we are completely unsuccessful at recruiting these guys. And so we're targeting them. Combined, all of these factors mean that we have not fixed our human intelligence collection apparatus. We are more proactive in acting on information, going after targets when we fix them, at least abroad. We have fairly refined technical intelligence collection capabilities, thank God, when it comes to signals intelligence, imagery, drones. We haven't fixed our human intelligence at all. And as I think I asserted up front, we're running out of time to do that. So that's great. Once again, I've laid out all kinds of depressing stuff. I told you that things are terrible, things are going to get worse, and right now we're not doing anything about it. So I feel like I should spend just a couple of minutes talking about making some kind of suggestion about how we might fix this. And then I'm going to open it up to questions, and we can take a deeper dive into pieces of this or explore other issues. I'm going to start by talking about fixing it in the context of the CIA. which is where I come from and maybe where I feel a little more comfortable, although I've done a lot of work with the FBI, particularly since I retired. I will go back and forth a little bit, but I'm going to start out by talking about the Central Intelligence Agency. So how are we going to fix this? Number one, biggest thing I can tell you is let's start by talking about what we should not do, what we cannot do. Please, God, let us not do. And that is attempt to fix this problem the same way we have attempted to fix this problem over and over and over since 9/11, which is by building a new agency, hiring thousands of more people, creating yet more lines on a wiring diagram that nobody in Washington understands, and spending yet more money. Okay, that's not the answer. We do not need more money, and we don't need more people. What we do need is some things like leadership, management, some decisions, some follow-through, some political will. And I will give you this analogy. There are any number of military folks here. I'm a Navy brat. My dad was a destroyerman, so I default to Navy analogies. You have a ship in the United States Navy, it's got rust coming down the sides, it's failing inspection, it's failing evals, it's being towed back to port every other time it goes out to sea. Absent some bizarre set of circumstances, it is highly unlikely that the solution is that you need to scrap the ship and lay the keel of a new one. In most cases, whether we use a ship analogy, a brigade analogy, a battalion analogy, the answer is we probably need to go relieve the skipper. We may very well need to fire a bunch of junior officers, maybe some chiefs along the way. We need to take control of this ship. We need to reimpose standards. We need to focus on results. We need to grab control of this thing and not focus on process, but focus on actually making concrete things happen. So to bring that down to the level of the Central Intelligence Agency. Step one, we need a president of the United States who makes a decision at the presidential level that fixing human intelligence, and by fixing I don't mean cosmetically, I mean an organization that will in fact penetrate ISIS, Al-Qaeda, let's step outside terrorism, the North Korean nuclear weapons program, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, maybe we're back in terrorism now, the Iranian nuclear weapons program, that is not a nice to have or an aspirational thing, but that is a requirement. That's the entire reason this organization exists. We will not accept anything less. And then puts people in charge with that understanding that A, they have the charter of the president, he or she, and B, that that's their job. Second thing you need to send somebody to Langley who actually understands the craft. There are any number of old graybeards sitting around Washington, D.C. waiting for this job. You need to send somebody to take charge of the Central Intelligence Agency who's done the work. No offense to any number of succession of DCIs and now DCIAs. You cannot send someone to run what is by definition a very arcane, very difficult to understand world who has never walked that walk. They are at the mercy of the people who are there, who will always tell them what is and is not possible and find it impossible to call their bluff. Not since Colby have we actually had a career case officer run CIA. Porter Goss had been a CIA case officer for a limited period of time, and Casey was in the OSS decades before, very briefly. But in terms of a career case officer, it's been that long. We have paid the price. We cannot afford somebody who is limited to sitting in the front office, showing up for photo ops, and trusting that the work's going to get done. We've got to have somebody who can go in there and make things happen. And they have to go with the charter that they are going to remake that organization, which means, again, I won't get lost in the minutia here, but I talked about focus on official cover. We got all our guys in official cover sitting in embassies. That's awesome. How am I supposed to go meet this guy who belongs to an Islamic extremist group? Is it impossible? By the way, it is not impossible. Have I done it? Yes. Basically, you're escaping from the straitjacket of your cover. Your cover is not only not helping you, it's hindering you. You have to go through all sorts of gyrations to escape from that. That should not be the mechanism. So what does that mean? We need to get people out of embassies. We need to get people out of official cover. We need to move to non-official covers. It also means, frankly, a number of other implications. It means you need to take the playbook you designed for 1950 and throw it out the window. It means new tradecraft. It means forget about thinking outside the box. It means forgetting the box exists. And just to be clear, it means an acceptance if you're going into the belly of the beast that you're going to take a lot more physical risk than has been the case. And you will, by the way, not do that without having bad days in which you pay the price. Everybody who's ever gone outside the wire knows, I don't care how tight you wire you're up, reality does not always cooperate with you. People will get killed and people will get hurt. If you are talking about collecting intelligence that may make the difference between whether or not we have to all evacuate Washington, D.C. for 50 years, then probably we're in the mode where we need to take that level of risk. But it is going to take, first and foremost, this being something that the President of the United States grabs a hold of, sends somebody there, and with that charter. And I guarantee you that when that day happens, if it ever does, you will hear the squealing all the way to Capitol Hill in a heartbeat, which is why I say you have to start with having the President of the United States behind it. Because if you do not have that political horsepower, it's a doomed effort. Last thing I'll touch on before you open it up to questions, the FBI. I think I've painted a picture of a reform at Central Intelligence Agency that would be difficult and require a lot of muscle. The FBI is, if anything, an even more daunting prospect. I'm a CIA guy. By definition, I'm not allowed to say anything positive about FBI people. I have noted over the years that their primary focus is to show up and call a press conference at which they take credit for an op that I've been running for 5 years and make no mention of the fact that we're in the picture. With that obligatory snarkiness out of the way, the domestic part of this collection is hugely important. I talked about the number of people being recruited on U.S. soil. Recruiting numbers now, identified ISIS recruitments on U.S. soil now, are running at 300% of what Al-Qaeda's was at its peak. That's identified. So keep in mind, that's ask a guy how many people are coming across the border. He can tell you how many he caught. He can't tell you how many he didn't catch. Okay, I mean, as you know only what you've grabbed a hold of. With those ISIS members that we have identified, that's 300%. And growing all of the time. So this is hugely important. The FBI is a law enforcement organization. Again, these are my opinions. By definition, that is the way they think, the way they act. There was an argument after 9/11 about whether we needed an American MI5. Whether we needed a separate domestic intelligence service, the FBI won that fight. So we now have a national security division within FBI. They are effectively domestic MI5, if you will. I would submit to you that that marriage, I'm not necessarily arguing for the creation of a separate bureaucracy, because God knows I know what that'll mean in Washington, D.C. We'll create a new bureaucracy. We still won't remove anybody from the FBI. They will retain every person they still have in their entire budget, and now we'll have thousands of more people on the payroll. I am not necessarily arguing for that. I'm saying to date that has been a marriage of very, very mixed results. Law enforcement is by definition a reactive organization. You get a report of wrongdoing, you investigate, you arrest people, you prosecute them, or you determine that the report was inaccurate. Intelligence is a completely different animal about being patient and recruiting sources. There's a reason why the report I cited earlier on noted that out of these 5 major attacks, we had no warning at all from any source that this was coming, even though all of these attacks are attacks that occurred on U.S. soil, because we effectively have no access. We have no such asset base. If it's going to remain within the FBI, that culture change is going to be on a scale even greater than what I just described at CIA. And it's going to take the same degree of political mindset. It's going to a complete transformation, and probably the creation of a completely new cadre of personnel, because I'm not sure that you can really take FBI special agents and teach them to be case officers in the sense that you have to be. First step from the White House, somebody's got to make the decision that that's going to happen and then follow through on it. Okay, that's enough good news for one day. So, questions about anything I've talked about or I didn't talk about, or and why the hell the CIA hired me in the first place or anything like that? Please, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious. I spent a lot of time
a lot of time in federal service, and my observation was that with a certain age, an agency loses the first generation of mission-oriented people, and the people that take over are basically the bureaucratic warriors who are careerists. I mean, you hear it mentioned in the Army's post-World War II generation that the careerists, and the agency, I think, is the same way. The headquarter type bureaucratic warriors run everything, and it would take a. Of course, no one wants to talk about the agency lost 25% of its staff during the Clinton years, and wondered why they didn't know what was going on with Al Qaeda. But I guess I don't see it in a happy ending. I mean, it looks like it would take a generation to not only create your case officers, but to put them to have that rare commodity of a case officer that can also be an effective manager.
Right. I'm assuming everybody in the back can hear that on the mic fine? Okay. I don't disagree really with any of your comments. There's a expression that was used. I apologize, I forget the author's name, but anyway, he was writing about the Central Intelligence Agency, and he described it, I think, which summarizes a lot of what you said, as having a bad case of bureaucratic hardening of the arteries. And it is true. I think it tracks maybe a lot, to some degree, with what happens in corporations. You know, you read about people who create the first steel, even guys in the steel industry, which we now think of as an old-fashioned established industry. You read about guys that are incredibly entrepreneurial, risk takers, pushing the envelope, doing things that are regarded as insane. You know, 75 years later, you have the ultimate bureaucracy that can't come up with an original idea to save its life. It is unfortunately true, in my opinion, that increasingly what you have is an organization that is run not by individuals, men and women who spent the last 30 years recruiting terrorist sources in the souk. You have it run by people who spent most of their time around the flagpole back in Washington, D.C., engaging in that kind of bureaucratic infighting. And we're paying the price for it. I don't know who, am I calling them people, or are you guys selecting them? I think this lady was next. I will have to start paying more attention if I now.
I was amazed and thrilled when you said, now we know that unaddressed, unresolved issues concerning race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, so forth, are at the seat of a lot of these tensions. However, it'll take 3 hours to get into all that. So what I'm curious about, I believe those things are what's driving a lot of these brewing resentments and conflict, right down to the recent shootings of the police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge and Ho Chi Minh, and, you know, the global picture of what fuels these brewing resentments that turn into these elongated conflicts. Is there a reason why we just pay a little lip service in one line to unresolved issues concerning inequality, race, ethnic, religious, and national tensions? Is there a reason for that? It seems so expensive to continuously ignore the heart of these tensions, so I'm curious.
Right. Well, I mean, there's probably any number of reasons in a whole bunch of a myriad of different situations. I mean, I think to use an example of the situation in Iraq and Syria, or let's just talk about Iraq. I mean, the ISIS has drawn its fuel from Sunni resentment and anger at what they regard as Shia oppression, and effectively, depending on who you talk to, the Iranians having taken over Baghdad as a client state, client capital. Why don't we deal with that? Because, I mean, my personal opinion, to go off on that tangent for a little bit, we are currently engaged in an offensive, retaking areas of territory in Iraq. We providing air cover, the Iraqi army, Shia militia, and to a certain extent the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, strangely enough, going into Sunni areas of western Iraq, destroying cities like Fallujah, in the aftermath of the capture of which something like 1,000 Sunni men just vanished off the face of the earth. So we have, you know, I mean, we're addressing the same old tensions and settling the same old scores as we go. Okay, so that's great that Fallujah was taken and ISIS doesn't control it anymore. When we're all done with this and we've retaken this Anbar province, and when the Shia militia and the Iranians have pursued every vendetta they have, do we seriously think that the Sunnis of western Iraq are now going to stay pacified? Like after, what are we now, pushing 1,500 years of this, that this is going to be the last fight? Because I think we've done this a few times before, right? This forest fire can reignite anytime you want, or anytime we don't want, if we do not address those underlying fundamental issues. Are we breaking Iraq up and acknowledge and just giving up and we're going to have 3 countries? Are we going to push a federal state solution and allow the Sunnis to be armed so that they feel safe and might actually remain in this country? I mean, we have somehow, one way or the other, we have to address that issue. We are, in fact, addressing none of those issues. We're just treating this as a military solution. Clearly not. I mean, it doesn't provide. So why aren't we doing that? It's complicated. It's hard. We'd prefer not to dig into it, to get political for a moment, because I think you can't have that conversation without acknowledging that the decision to remove American troops in 2011 turned this loose again. That's now, I'm not, whether we should have ever invaded in the first place, that is by no means an absolution of the Bush administration for their conduct of everything they did. That is not my point. My point is, where we were in 2011, it is very clear that walking away turned this loose again. We had walked through fire and beaten them once, and then we allowed the fire to reignite. Very hard now if we acknowledge that that's the fundamental issue. I don't know. Short version is we don't want to wrestle with it. So too often we are doing nothing but doing Band-Aid solutions to things. Who's next? I've lost track. I can't even see them in the back.
How about this gentleman right here?
I wonder if you could comment on the case of the triple agent, the Jordanian, who we thought we had turned and was a mole.
You talk about Camp Chapman and Coast?
Yeah, in 2009. Yeah, he was a Jordanian who we thought was inside Al-Qaeda. Turned out he was, but he was actually a triple agent. He wasn't just a mole. So it seems to me a counterexample to some extent to your thesis, because there was an effort made to recruit in that case, at least that's become public to those of us not in the community.
Well,
secondly, how do you prevent it? And third, doesn't that help to explain some of the hesitancy about recruitment, given how devastating that was with 9 people killed in one attack?
All right, I'm going to try to keep track of all those questions, and when I lose one, you call me on it. So, first of all, just I'm not sure everybody here is aware of what the Camp Chapman Coast attack was. In very short, very, very cursory fashion, a CIA base in Afghanistan brought a source into the base for a meeting, and he was wearing a suicide vest, and he detonated the vest, and in one way or the other, it either killed or wounded effectively the entire base complement. So to take the questions out of order, I think the second question was, does that contradict my thesis? So as my wife would tell you, after 37 years of marriage, I never admit that I'm wrong. So I have to come up with some reason why it doesn't. First, it is not my thesis that nobody in the Central Intelligence Agency has ever recruited a terrorist source. I recruited several. My wife, probably, who was also a retired CIA officer, probably the most picture-perfect recruitment of a terrorist and then running of that terrorist that I've ever even heard of. Absolutely classic. Nothing, my thesis, I guess, is not on anything approaching the scale. Also, I would add that we didn't actually recruit the guy you're talking about. The Jordanians recruited the guy who was the source, and then we were running him more or less jointly with the Jordanians at the time. So not really what I'm talking about in terms of a unilateral effort by the CIA to go out and recruit them. Comments. I mean, the guy, hesitating because actually several of the individuals that were killed in that attack, actually, I knew personally. Everything you could do wrong in the handling of a source in that environment was done wrong. To the point where when I first heard the description of the event, the only way I can describe it to you is I almost went into anaphylactic shock. It was almost like that can't physically be possible that they did that. He was met on the street, picked up in a vehicle, not searched, brought into the compound, brought up to the base house, still not searched, and then the entire base complement came out of the building and crowded around the vehicle because the chief of base had decided because it was his birthday they were going to give him a birthday cake. No, I didn't make that up. And only as he left the vehicle, because one of the security guys that was sitting in the vehicle stepped out and then asked the source to come out behind him out the door, and the source scooted across the seat and went out the vehicle on the other side. And only at that point, because of that strange behavior, did anybody finally think maybe we should check this guy. And he detonated his vest. I'm not going to get lost in the details of tradecraft, some of which is proprietary, sources and methods. All I can tell you is I've run a lot of operations where we handled dangerous sources in similar environments, and there's about 17 separate things that needed to be done. Start with this. We didn't need to bring the whole base near him ever. First of all, that's a counterintelligence issue. Forget about physical security. Why does he need to see the faces of 17 of the whole base? He shouldn't have been in the vehicle without being searched. Forget about being at the base house without being searched. We could go down the list. So to come back to what I think was your last question, if I'm still tracking, I do not minimize the danger involved in running operations like we're talking about. All I'm saying is we don't have any choice. And fundamentally, at this point in history, that's what the CIA should exist for. And it is possible to run sources and do it safely on the street. You just need to keep your wits about you. There is no such thing as trusting somebody. Forget about that. You can tell the guy you trust him all you want. Say whatever you want. You can also tell him he's your brother. None of that's true. You stay alive by not trusting people. Did I hit all your questions? Who am I on to next?
We have a lady back here.
Okay, we got somebody back here.
Hi, unilateral recruitment. My question is, in the process of recruiting and training agents to infiltrate terrorist organization, you call it inside the belly of the beast, how do you verify or know that the intelligence provided came from a reliable source and could be actionable?
Right. Well, excellent question. Right. So you start from this premise as a point of departure from the last question. I don't trust anybody. And the fact that your lips are moving and you're telling me something that's interesting to me, but does not in and of itself give me any reason to believe that it's true until I find reasons to believe that it's true. So how do you do that? Well, you do that in a variety of ways. I mean, first of all, which amounts to finding ways to corroborate your information, other sources of information, testing you on things that I can independently verify. You say you're in and out of this camp all the time. Well, presumably I have imagery of that camp. So draw me a diagram of that camp and tell me where everything's located. You see, I ask you questions that I already know the answer to. I ask you questions that I know you couldn't possibly get the answer to, and then see if you give me the answers anyway. It won't necessarily tell me whether you're working for somebody else, but it definitely tell me you're lying. In effect, this is an ongoing process. This is a continuous process of vetting people, evaluating them constantly. And really, it never ends. I mean, one of the things we tell junior officers, particularly in a high-risk meeting environment like we're talking about with Coast, is this. You had your boy, okay, and I'm using that term just in the context that we use it in the trade. You had your guy. You threw him out. He was right as rain. You believed everything he said to you. You haven't seen him in 3 weeks. He's been up in the tribal areas for 3 weeks. Now you're going to recover him. Maybe you were right. Maybe he's never told you a lie in his life. He was 100% on your side the last time you saw him. You have not seen him in 3 weeks. You don't know what happened to him in those 3 weeks. Well, guarantee you that if he was detected, captured, beaten, and had to choose between watching his firstborn child cut up in pieces in front of him or ratting you out, he did not choose you over the other alternative. So no matter what he was the last time you put it out there, this is like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? He may look like your guy, he may smell like your guy, until you're sure, you don't know that he's still your guy, ever. Back to Coast, that much more incomprehensible. There is no such thing as, you get in my vehicle, I trust you, I don't need to search you. All that equals is dead, which unfortunately has happened in that situation. Sir.
Based on your experience, how much of the other guys, the bad guys, how much of the bad guy's motivation is ideological, religion, or just getting revenge because his cousin got killed and he heard this story and it's all emotional and that's what he's going to do? And how do you intervene in something like that?
Right. So, I mean, whenever you're recruiting somebody, the first part of that process is assessing somebody and mapping what in the trade they would call motivations and vulnerabilities. What makes you tick? What makes you, why are you where you are? Why might you work for me? Why might you not work for me? And those motivations are often really, really commonplace and mundane, right? I mean, you're recruiting an SVR officer, Russian intelligence. You know what his big motivation is? His big motivation is his boss is sleeping with his wife. He got passed over for promotion. Not anything to do with ideology, communism versus the United States, anything else. In my experience, you can find the same thing among jihadists, to use that term. You will find the guy who is the leader of the group who is 100% absolutely committed to the cause, and he's never coming across, he's never talking, and you can kill him or put him in a cage, or I don't know what we're doing, but okay. You're going to find the guy who, yes, is motivated by he believes Americans have done something to him personally, to his tribe personally. I recruited a guy, actually, who was a member of Al-Qaeda once, who I have always described as being an Al-Qaeda bureaucrat. He was a facilitator, and he was generally ideologically aligned with them, but really what it had turned into was he got paid pretty well, and he was a facilitator. He moved people back and forth to Afghanistan and acquired resources, and it had turned into a comfortable middle-aged job for him, which is why in his case he then flipped and went to work for us. But yes, absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely a basket of motivations.
Radical Islam or revenge? Because because there's a war going on and people are getting killed?
Well, I think so are you asking me, are we fueling it or feeding it or making it worse?
So this sudden radicalization, which is something that's happened recently in history,
Right.
is driven by something. It's driven by war. It's driven by horror. It's driven by horror stories.
I mean, I guess.
It's not driven by Islam. They just search for that, and that gives them the relationships, but the emotion that drives it, that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think the way that I would characterize it is not to say that personal motivations are not important, or frankly, not just personal motivation, because I've just finished talking about, look, I mean, what's ISIS feeding off of? ISIS is feeding off a fissure, if we're talking about Iraq, a fissure opened in that nation by virtue of a Sunni-Shia divide. And yes, is there a religious component to that? But quite frankly, after 1,500 years, a lot of that is just memory and old grievances and feuds and whatever. I mean, about as probably as theological as a struggle between Presbyterians and Catholics might have been in Ulster, right? Are we really debating fine points of theology here, or are we feeding, or is this more about identification? But I guess the way I would look at it is, we have, without any question, in my view, individuals who are espousing and pushing a particular ideology, and they take advantage of all of these things to recruit and manipulate and use people. Yeah, you are a Sunni Iraqi, and you're a Ba'athist, and you used to be a colonel in Saddam's army, and you're about as secular as they come, really. Maybe you went to mosque once a week. And yet now you may very well, or I should say, you were about as secular as they come. And now you are in fact a member of ISIS. One of the things that people often don't discuss, how much of the capability of ISIS is due to the fact that they have such a large proportion of former members of Saddam's army, including senior officers. Now you have this guy recruited by and working within ISIS. Did they manipulate his resentment at losing his position, at everything that happened to him, at the ascendancy of the Shia? But it doesn't change the fact that what they're pushing is an ideology. I mean, he's not sitting there as the same guy just working for them. My take. Maybe we'll agree to disagree on that. Or we can take it on after the break.
Does it take a Saddam to put a cover on it? Do we have to become like Saddam? Do we have to have prisons where people are talking?
Yeah, well, no. Well, no. I mean, I don't agree that it does, and B, I don't think that's an option, okay?
Because had we been intelligent, we would have taken over Saddam's old intelligence services, and like we did, with the Germans who had intelligence on the Soviet Union, the Gehlen Group, and run them.
So, I mean, look, I as a baseline, let me say this. We say that we don't have a state religion in the United States. I think that's inaccurate. We have a state religion. It's democracy. It's freedom. It's liberty. All of those things to me mean something. There is no option by which we become Saddam Hussein. Winning the war at the cost of transforming into something where we have thrown away every value that was important to us is not an option. That's not victory. That looks a lot like defeat to me. I don't believe it's necessary. Did taking the lid off of all those rivalries in Iraq set this loose? Without question. It did. Is putting the lid back on the only answer? No. I don't believe so. Are we able to, and I don't want to get lost in just talking about Iraq, are we really going to be able to keep Iraq intact at this point? I don't know anymore. I, for a long time, have kind of dragged my heels in that and said we need to be looking for some sort of federal structure. Day by day, I wonder more whether we'll be able to make that happen. I'm going to move on to this poor lady over here. I think has been raising her hand forever.
So I feel like a lot of what you said is very true, that we used to be really good at this tradecraft. I mean, okay, full disclosure, I'm addicted to the Americans, and I think that's awesome what they did. And I know that, that capability...
Aren't they the bad guys?
yes, but we did the same thing. But I feel like part of this, yes, is the leadership piece that you mentioned, but also like I think that there's a huge tension between the collectors, the operators, and the analysts. And I think that that is another place where it's broken. The system is broken and we have to fix that. I don't know what the answer is. I'd welcome, any ideas. Maybe it's, like in the military, they make us do, a little bit of everything, right? So you do a couple of years. I did a couple of years as a humanter and I did a couple of years as a siganter, and you get an appreciation for what the others go through and you find the affinity, the thing that fits you the best. But in the end, by the time you're in a leadership position, you've experienced at least a taste of all of those things and you have a better understanding and comprehension. I don't know how that would work, in the agency, but it seems like it might be a potential solution.
So, I mean, I'm by way of caveat up front, there are all kinds of things that needs fixed at CIA, and certainly addressing cultivation of leaders, managers, training of leaders, managers. That's a huge piece. I mean, the way the CIA works now is you're a successful case officer, you work as an individual, you recruit a bunch of sources, so you become chief of station, because that means you can supervise 400 people. The fact that you can recruit anybody, the fact that those two skills don't necessarily have any relationship to each other seems to have eluded people. So you can have a very, very good case officer who recruits everybody on Earth and can't manage his way out of a paper bag in a station, and everybody suffers. So that is a huge issue. Now, for the obligatory "I'm an arrogant old case officer" comment, if you're talking about case officers whose job it is to recruit strategic level sources, I think you are talking about a very unique set of skills. No case officer I ever met who was any good would ever work as an analyst. A, because they're too arrogant. B, because they would really be terrible at it. Because, right, you can walk into a room for a briefing and know who the case officers are. They're the ones in the back with their feet up on the table asking if the meeting's over yet. They're too cool for school. They're the guy who always made wisecracks in the back of class, all that kind of stuff. The reports officers are all the ones with 3 number 2 pencils lined up in front of a legal pad. And the analysts are trying to divine some deep significance from the meeting and why it's happening then. So anyway, I mean, I'm being a little silly, but I mean, I do think that when it comes to that cadre of case officers, you're talking about folks that you really need to recruit separately, and also because it takes a long time to get good at it. I mean, I know when I came on as a junior officer, it was basically like, great, you graduated from the farm. That's great for you. Sit down, shut up. When you've made about 300 asset meetings and recruited about a dozen people, then you can talk in meetings. Until then, there's nothing we need to hear from you. Okay, there's something to be, I mean, that's a little extreme, but there's something to be said for the seasoning that needs to happen. So I think there are a lot of things that need to be fixed at CIA. I don't think taking case officers and making them more into generalists is the answer. I don't think. Personal opinion. All right, I'm going to let you be the one who makes the call because I don't want to get punched or anything here.
Thank you. Going back to Iraq and speaking about the importance of intelligence and
I just escaped from Iraq.
And anticipation.
I just, after all, now you're dragging me back into the quagmire.
And
it's been my fate since 2002 when I crossed the border.
The relationship with intelligence and political decisions. Do you think the situation of ISIS would be different today if the U.S. would have targeted Zarqawi, for example, before the intervention in Iraq? Because the U.S. had the information then, but you didn't act. I mean,
yeah, so as full disclosure, I'm the one that gave them that information because that was what we were doing in Iraq in 2002. So it was my team that put together the plan to get rid of those guys in the summer of 2002. That the Bush administration decided not to act on because they were afraid it would derail the invasion of Iraq. So do I think that it would have made a difference? Yes, that's why I gave them the plan to kill those guys then. Do I still think we should have killed them then? Yes, I do think we would have killed them then. Is that killing those particular guys on that occasion, would that have been the answer to every possible issue? No, but it certainly would have been a good start. Having a plan for what let's see, I'm assuming we invaded. Having a coherent plan for what we were going to do after we invaded, that would have been nice too. As opposed to disbanding the entire security service, all the Iraqi army, and then hoping for the best. That was not a well thought through plan.
Do you think the impact of technology has any significance on human intelligence today? It's like such as social media?
Yeah, I think there all sorts of technology has impact, and social media is a huge part of what we're dealing with. So, for instance, if you look at people that are being recruited by ISIS in the United States now, are they true lone wolves? No, I think that's largely a myth that the media has created. But does social media play a huge role in that? Is that a complicating factor and something we need to look at? Yes. But look, the job of a case officer, of anybody involved in human intelligence, is to incorporate technology into the trade, right? In other words, whatever the target is we're looking at, whatever the capability is, we work that in. It doesn't really change the fundamentals of the trade. It's just, okay, it's just another element. By this point, we have a very good, very clear idea of how social media is being used to recruit people, radicalize people, put people in contact. We also have a very, very refined capability for looking at all of that social media. That's actually one of the things we do very well. So, we should be aware of that and just incorporate it into, for instance, if you're looking at a guy and he is on all sorts of jihadist websites and chat rooms and talking to people, I think you ought to take note of that. Am I saying from that means he ought to be arrested, imprisoned, throw away the key? That's not what I'm saying. Should you understand that in the current environment, that's a possible indicator that this guy's about to do something? Yeah. Same as you would have seen some other behavior 10, 20 years ago and known what it meant.
Well, sir, I want to thank you again on behalf of IWP for showing up, and for you too, everyone in the audience, thank you so much for coming out, and we'll certainly have more to come.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.